Hello, and hope all is well. Thank you so much for tuning in. For our message this week from Isaiah chapter 40, we're pushing on into the depths of what has become the go-to passage in the Bible about the greatness of God. Verses 12 to 17. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales and the hills in a balance? Who can fathom the Spirit of the Lord or instruct the Lord as his counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him? And who taught him the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge or showed him the path of understanding? Surely the nations are like a drop in a bucket. They're regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires, nor its animals enough for burnt offerings. Before him all the nations are as nothing. They are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing. Well, this section of the chapter that we're in began in verse 9 with the instruction from the Lord to bring good news to his people, to turn up the volume, to not be afraid. And the good news is at the end of verse 9, behold your God. Here he is. The good news is God himself. The good news for us is who he is and what he's like. And last week we saw that he's both the mighty warrior and the tender shepherd. That same arm that rules with might is the one that gathers up the lambs. Well, this week, with these verses, I think are simply meant to expand our minds to such an extent that our heads might explode, giving a magnificent vision of God. So here goes. We have two sets of questions in verses 12 to 14. The first set, where these show us that God is big. God is very big. God is immeasurably big. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? Well, what can you measure in the hollow of your hand? We picked some blackberries while out walking at the weekend, and we were struggling to hold just a dozen or so small berries in the palm of our hands without dropping them. Well, God holds all the waters of the earth, every ocean, lake and river, in the hollow of his hand. Well, we can only hold the tiniest of puddles of water. Well, the next question, who with the breadth of his hand has marked off the heavens? Well, what can you mark with the span of your hand from thumb to little finger? I can't even measure off the 2-meter social distance to keep between me and the next person, let alone the sheer vast expanse of the heavens. But God easily marks this off with the span of his hand. Now, of course, this is poetic language with these questions, but it is meant to teach truth about God that blows our minds. I think the word for this is called, and I always struggle to pronounce this correctly, I think it's called anthropomorphism. And what it means is it's taking human characteristics and using them to describe non-human things, in this case God. But by using such things, it puts it in terms that we can understand and grasp. And so Barry Webb, in his book on Isaiah, says, Isaiah clothes these age-old truths in vivid language so that it will penetrate the dullness of those who are almost past hope, to take fresh hold of them and to lift them up. So the next question, who has held the dust of the earth in a basket? Well, if I were to go now and sweep out my shed, I reckon there'd be about a basket full of dust and dirt, just from one small shed. Yet God holds all the dust of every landscape of the world in his basket. The mountains he weighs on his scales. We only weigh a few 100 grams of flour. The hills are on his balance. Apart from God, there's nothing else in existence that is so big that we can't measure it. The tallest man, the largest whale, the deepest ocean, the furthest planet, we've measured them all, but not God. Our view of God is far too small. We need to expand our minds, our vision of who he is. And as we do it, well, it puts the span of our short lives into perspective. And it also changes how we view the situations we face when we take the focus off ourselves and onto the magnitude of God. Well, that's the first set of questions. God is immeasurably big. What about the second set? Well, these show us that God is wise. God is very wise, and he is wise in his own right. There's nothing else that is wise in its own right. Even the wisest person who has ever lived had to be taught and continues learning until the day they die. But who can fathom the Spirit of the Lord? Or who can instruct the Lord as his counselor? The answer to every single one of these 11 questions on the screen is the same. None of us can. No one at all. So even the most influential leader or the world-renowned academic, no human can instruct the Lord. All the ideas, all the genius of life and love were his and his alone. And as we read on, we see God doesn't need to hire a consultant to enlighten him, to teach him the right way. But his knowledge and understanding of the universe and the events of our world, and even, especially, the situations of our lives, well, his wisdom on these things is not lacking one bit. It's the height of arrogance, isn't it, when we decide it is our job to tell God what he's got right and what he's got wrong, to sit in judgment on him, to think that we know better. And when we do this, we just don't see how arrogant it is. And that's because we think so highly of ourselves as a human race. Our view of God is too small, and our view of ourselves, well, it's just too big. So in these 11 questions, we see the greatness of God. He is immeasurably big and infinitely wise. Well, what about verses 15 to 17? Well, here's where Isaiah's message applies to his listeners. The nations were a threat to the people of God. They had and would attack and conquer them. The unstoppable nation of Babylon was wiping the floor of every other nation at the time and was coming for the people of Judah. No one could stand in their way. Yet to God, surely the nations are like a drop in a bucket. Can you see it there? A drop in a bucket. Well, they are merely dust on God's scales. Even a whole island is just like one grain of sand. And one nation in particular comes into view. Lebanon, renowned for its massive cedar forests. So what if you could cut down all those huge trees and collect them together in one massive pile of wood and then round up all the animals of Lebanon as burnt offerings on this one humongous fire? Would such sacrifices be worthy of this vast God? Well, not even close. So the question that we're left is where will your loyalty lie? Not with the nations. See, in this final verse, it's not that the people of the nations don't matter to God or are not loved by him, but that before him, before God, in comparison to him, they are nothing. So the people's loyalty, well, it must be with God, because true greatness applies to no one else. His greatness is off the scale. So the message here, all that is happening and is about to happen is under God's control. And these verses are a call to remain loyal to him through it all. What else can you do? Where else would you go? When you see and have this vision that here is who God is and this is what he's like, nothing or no one compares to him. Well, Raymond Ortland puts it like this: when we begin to see God through God's eyes, we see the promises of God as more real, more weighty, more solid than anything else in all of life.